My name is Rene Vaugeois. Been born and raised here in Treaty 6 territory. So what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit more of musings on the reflections of partnerships and reflections on the work over the years. When I sat back to reflect on kind of the description I put together, I was reflecting on, at that time, the issues around debt and trade imbalances and this whole culture around economic austerity that exists right now and how alive that is. And I thought that was really kind of ironic today to be talking about that and about economic austerity, because many in our community right now are greatly struggling as a result of this climate of economic austerity that we live in. So to give some context, recently, actually this week, the government of Alberta made changes to AISH, which is the income support for people living with disabilities, and also other income supports, without notifying the front lines and government agencies, without notifying people who receive supports. And this has had huge ricochet effects in our community just this week, where we have people who are expecting their income supports and they're finding they're short $100 and they're finding they're short $400, but there's no clear reasoning that's been transferred to them about why. In the advocacy work I do, I received an email from a landlord actually asking what was going on, and this is what she had to say. Clearly, this is causing great hardship, including fear of no longer having enough money to either eat or pay rent. A decrease of this kind obviously shouldn't happen, as present costs of living are in no way indexed to these funds. If for some reason this vulnerable and already underserved population is facing a substantial income cut, it should come with some kind of written explanation and warning so people can make bill arrangements. And it was interesting that this came about this week when we were wanting to talk about this in economic austerity, because it is alive and well in our backyards and in our homes today. And I just wanted to point that one out, because if you're really caring or concerned about people, particularly living with disabilities, who are struggling right now to make ends meet, there is a march on Thursday, February 27th at 4 o'clock at the legislature. And that is being organized by a pan-disability group. And really encourage folks to get out there and support them. Because sometimes when we talk about partnerships, it's about actually just getting our butts out and supporting the people who need us to stand beside them or with them and to help walk that journey. Sometimes it's not about us figuring out beautiful projects to do. Sometimes it's just about us being present. And when we talk about what were the rationale for some of these changes, there's a lot of debate that's happening out there, but the suspicion is that the delay of these payments is having an impact on the final numbers in our books in Alberta at the end of the year. And those are things that we need to be talking about, we need to be aware of, whether we're concerned about credit ratings or whether we're concerned about people who need to eat or people who need to get by. Because I will guarantee you, people who live with disabilities in this community are one of the most marginalized. And you may not see them as much. And there are a lot of people living with invisible disabilities, but the fact that it's not normalized and we do not see them is a reason why we need to stand up together. So this language of austerity and this need to keep our financial books in order is one that is important to enter into our discourse and debate in civil society, because it impacts us all. And how do we work towards being fiscally responsible in this era, but not letting those who are the most marginalized be impacted by this? And this is ultimately what we have seen happen over the last year in Alberta. We've seen this call for fiscal responsibility and for tempering how we spend our resources, but not necessarily done in a way that balances out the needs of our most marginalized communities. So when we are talking about partnership to me is about creating these spaces where we can engage constructively on these issues and find solutions. Are we just making cuts, or are we targeting the inefficiencies? Are we targeting the redundancies that exist? And I've seen this, Carrie mentioned about the work in East Africa as well, and I've seen this in the work in East Africa as well, as this desire to support kind of the work overseas and for this idea about global citizenship that was IWEEK kind of stands for that, this idea that we are global citizens and that we have a responsibility not only here within our own backyard, but we impact and are impacted by many things that happen around the world. We all carry these things around with us, but do we really know the impacts of what these things do to people in other countries? It's huge. It's huge. And it's about being conscious and aware of that. And I don't want to traumatize, but we could link sexual violence and many things to things like the technology that we all rely on to be part in our daily lives and being part as global citizens. When we're thinking about this work and our role as global citizens, when I reflect on the work in Uganda, I've seen over the years how in Alberta, people are becoming much more reluctant to engage with work overseas, where maybe there's a questioning of this white savior complex that has existed around development and this idea of charity. But I think we also have to think a little bit and have conversations about what is our responsibility. And we really need to center on exposing and fighting the injustices in these systems and find the spaces to really hold state and government agencies to account and strengthen civil society's ability to do that. So when I think about this work, and I think about the work I've done at the John Humphrey Center and that over the years, I think about partnerships, and I think about that shifting landscape that's happening. I think one of my biggest lessons and learnings over the years is this realization is for us to affect change is we can't depend on those that are necessarily working within government or those who are in elected offices. It's actually us as civil society that is the critical piece, the most critical piece in pushing for change, because elected officials change. They're transient in nature. People even that work within the public sector, they change. I've, over the years, been involved in many partnerships, particularly, for example, with law enforcement, where we'll be working and I finally feel like we're getting somewhere, and then that person is transitioned to a new job. And we have to start the relationship building all from the very beginning. So when we rely on these public systems and public elected officials to do the change, we're kind of missing the boat, I feel. And where I see the changing nature of partnerships is the changing nature of partnerships for me is at the grassroots level is in with civil society. And I think now more than ever, there's this kind of urgent need for us to create those spaces where there's intersectionality and we're working across our differences. Even the human rights architecture that was built at the United Nations over the years, if you look at the 13 conventions that are in place, is that they're very focused on one specific demographics. So we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have the Convention on Migrants. We have all these different conventions that support the unique rights of different groups of people. However, what that's done, that idea is it's also parceled off our work. We become very segregated in our work and how we connect with each other. And that is the most important thing, is to be able to connect across our communities to affect change together. But given our historical relationships and the power imbalances, kind of these efforts to build these partnerships require a real deep commitment and time to work through those differences and to really find a paradigm that grounds us and in the right place. And I think that's really critical, where we need to be actively creating space for communities that face oppression and build strength for those voices. And these voices have precedent and say. And it's time to kind of elevate voice and to create partnerships that really are shifting the balances of power. So when I think, what do we have? What do we have at the international level to be able to do partnerships, to be able to affect change? And I'm always coming at the lens of human rights. I'm always coming at the lens of how do we look at things and how do we shift things. When I think about human rights, there's a number of different mechanisms that we can use to claim rights. Many of them aren't so great. Many of them aren't working the greatest. But when I think about what we have to hold our governments to account, it is the only thing that we have. It is the only thing that we have at an international level to go outside of our state to hold governments accountable. And I just, when we think about the claiming of rights, I think here within Canada, we can reflect on the use of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, in reflecting about how do we fight for human rights. A lot of people will use the Charter to go to court to fight against abuse of the state. The most important thing to understand about the Charter is a document that protects us from abuse of the state. It's not something that protects me from you or you from each other. It's meant to protect us from the state, and hence why we have these legal capacities to fight in court. However, what's interesting is that system, the justice system and the legal system, is very, very broken. Many of us don't even know that up until 1961, the Indigenous peoples of this land could not even raise funds to go into legal battle, to fight for their land or to claim their rights. 1961. That's not very long ago when you put it in perspective. And I've been working with a lawyer here in Edmonton who's been working on a class action case against the government using the charter around child welfare. And he's been doing this battle for 19 years. And I always like to think that I have hope, but my most recent connection with him actually left me really quite sad, reflecting on the role of our justice system and how it's becoming more and more difficult for people who are trying to push up against the systems and to affect change, how difficult it is for them to keep going on in the work. And even the use of genocide was used in that discussion with him because he's feeling at a loss. He's feeling broken. The systems that we have here with Canada don't work. So when they work sometimes, they just don't work all the time. And so I realize I may make blanket statements, and I think I'm coming from a pretty pessimistic point of view at the moment, and I just apologize for that. In Canada as well, we have the Human Rights Commissions, which exist at the provincial and federal level, which is it's a really important space for us to use in terms of like claiming issues around discrimination. We've seen at the national level that the Canadian Human Rights Commission played a really important role with putting child welfare on the agenda in relation to First Nations people. However, the government of Canada kind of holds it and it sits and it's not moving forward effectively. However, there is a tribunal decision that's come down that is forcing the government of Canada to stand up and to come to some conclusions. The trick is that I believe that making settlements is not how we seek justice. I don't think offering $40,000 to every person is how we seek justice, because we're not seeking to change the systems that are causing the problem in the first place. And if you look at child welfare, even here in Alberta, 1990, 55% of children in care in Alberta were Indigenous. Today, it's over 70%. So the number of children in care today is higher than what the number of children that were in residential schools back when. So this context of reality is really important for us to understand. And this is why I feel like when we talk about partnerships, we really have to talk about moving to the international level. I think more and more I believe that civil society needs to engage with human rights mechanisms that exist at the United Nations through the various committees of the convention, through submissions of shadow reports to inform processes, through using the formal complaint mechanisms that exist at the United Nations, because I feel like the only place that we can have a neutral and fair space to be heard about the issues in Canada is at the United Nations, because it's too easy for them to get covered up here or to get stalled here and just hold out. And just an example of that, many of you will know that the Indian Act was an act that was very discriminatory, particularly against Indigenous women and against Two-Spirit people. The Indian Act was put in place to really decimate the matriarchal structures that existed on Turtle Island. But it wasn't until the United Nations said something about it that we started to see change. And that came with a woman from Northwest Territories, actually Sandra Lovelace, in 1977 to 1981. She went to the United Nations and she fought because she lost her status and her rights as an Indigenous person because she married a white guy. And she fought that. She took it all the way to the United Nations, and it was finally then in 1985, because of the pressure of that case, that Bill C-31 came down, where the United Nations said to Canada they needed to address the gender discrimination in the Indian Act. Another case is before the United Nations today, Sharon McIver, and she's trying to push that a little bit further. So at the international level, what we need to understand is Canada has this reputation. Canada has this beautiful reputation of being the key peace builder, the nation that has it all, and everything else is covered under below, the racism, all these dynamics that happen in Canada. But it is only at that space where I feel that we can really push, because Canada has a deep desire to retain that image, and it's only when things are exposed and pushed at that level that I feel like we can affect change, and where it's not controlled by the state. Because a lot of the spaces that we have to push the agenda here are controlled by the state. If you have a problem with the police, who do you need to complain to? The police. That doesn't work. It doesn't allow us to really look at changing the systems that exist. And then just one kind of final point about like these roles in this piece about the international level is while I know a lot of people will complain that the United Nations system doesn't work or is just defunct, there's a lot of challenges with UN. Guarantee you that. The Security Council in and of itself is a predicament for the United Nations. However, the human rights architecture that has been built at the United Nations is growing and evolving in really great ways, and I think we need to engage with that. But the other mechanism that we have when we're looking at abuses of human rights, whether it's here or whether it's elsewhere in the world, and I'll give an example, is this idea of the use of universal jurisdiction. What the heck is that? So universal jurisdiction is a new emerging kind of realm in the legal world where we can use the national justice systems of certain states to be able to hold violators of human rights to account. For example, many of you may have known a number of years ago, Canada actually tried some of the Rwandan perpetrators here in Canada, and that was under universal jurisdiction. So that is something that exists today, and when I think about partnerships, I think about the diverse ways that we can partner, and one of the partnerships that has been emerging for us has been with a group of Turkish judges and lawyers, actually, who have been pushed out of Turkey. There's a lot of persecution right now of certain minorities in Turkey. I've even used the word genocide about what's happening to some groups in Turkey. Some people would argue with me about that. But I think when we see a real intentional targeting of a group, mass imprisonment, mass deportations, numbers of different things, I think we can start to think about using these words. And some of the things that are happening in Turkey are quite profound. So these judges and lawyers who are now outside of Turkey, we've started a group where we're just starting to engage and learn with each other and talk about the possibilities of how do we hold some of these people to account who are perpetrating human rights violations. And what we're doing is really then starting to identify countries that we can do casework in. And so we actually have one case in Germany right now, because Germany is one of those countries that can try perpetrators from other countries. So I think more and more, I guess as a summary, at the end of the day, those of us who are going to affect change are not the people who are in elected offices per se. They are the people that sit here right now. They are the people here who are going to be working in the long term. And we have to think about that, and we have to understand that while it's overwhelming, we have to build partnerships where we're working together to push these systems a lot harder than we do, and to use these spaces outside of our state to be able to hold people to account. So that is kind of my reflection, and I hope I'll look forward to the next two presenters. Thank you.